Well, as it is 1913 or 1813 or 1513, depending on where you are, I'd like to welcome people to the Inside the OutHaus episode 1 for 2021. It's great to have you all back, and hopefully you'll in the future invite more of your friends, and we'll develop this forum as being a strong voice for the outdoor sector in the world. We are perhaps, I like to say, the metaphoric John Farnham of your programs, adventures, journeys, trials and tribulations as we facilitate experiences, educate and enlighten in the nature space. My name is Pete Smith, founder, orator and telemarketer, and it's great to have you all back in the year of 21. Just before I go on, I'll throw over to one of the other great management team to do the Acknowledgement of Country.
Hey guys, Shri here. In the spirit of reconciliation, Inside the OutHaus acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And I will pass to Henry to tell you guys about the topic.
Thanks, Shri. So our first topic back in the OutHaus this year is about planes, trains, automobiles, and buses, about how we access the outdoor experience. So there's a lot of different questions that we kind of like to explore. Luckily, David's quite nicely posted some of them in the chat. So we'd like to take a deeper look today into how participants access program venues and the value of the time in transit, transporting limitations, both for COVID and more generally, how they might, and what their implications are for programming, the value of international expeditions and their sustainability, and a thought around distance versus local programming. So I might throw it up to the floor first and just have a sense of what the current experience is with transportation in 2021, knowing the background of COVID as a starting point. Did anyone want to start us off? David, I might throw you under the
I'll throw a couple of comments in. I guess having been involved in this industry for a bit of time now, a bit of a, shall we say, an old campaigner, I think that we have definitely been an industry, shall we say, a sector that has done a lot of long distance transport from where participants, clients, whatever you want to call them, start their outdoor experience to where they actually have their outdoor experience. And I have found that in some cases, that time on buses, trains, planes, automobiles is perhaps not used as well as we could use it. And we could perhaps use it to front load and brief about programs, get students working on things like working agreements, full value contracts, so that when they actually hit the program venue, they're actually more keyed into what's going on the program and less, oh, we've just got off the bus, now the program starts, even though we've been on the bus. And I've been on programs where students are on buses for like, you know, a day and a half. So I'd like people to maybe comment on that in their own experience and also just what they've seen around the place.
I'll jump in. Again, similar to Pete, been on trips where I've been driving the support vehicles or the the equipment and the staff to meet a group on expedition, but also been on a program, and one particular one for a girls' school in Victoria, where the journey actually started by meeting at the airport and then flying, 3 hours interstate and having the whole drama of the logistics to get to the start of the venue becoming part of actually the journey for them. And it wasn't a bad thing. It created, I've been who I am, I micromanaged it pretty well, and up to the point where the 14-year-old student, as she was walking across the tarmac, to get onto the plane, lost the boarding pass, and she's running across the tarmac, chasing the boarding pass, and we're all now stressing that she's going to get hit by a plane or security's going to jump on her. But that was hilarious in retrospect after we got the student onto the plane, and then having the whole issue of them all wanting to change positions on the plane, and how that will affect the balance of the plane and things like that. But the actual journey itself became part of the program of whatever I can't remember exactly what it was: exploration, resilience, risk taking. It became part of that journey because for quite a few of them, for some of them, it was their first time interstate and on a plane by themselves without their parents in tow. So having that personal responsibility became part of that journey. That was obviously big planes, get onto the vehicles and all that type of stuff, and then there was other transport modes. But the I've seen very negative aspects where they're just on a bus and they just sleep the whole time or they're on their phones, to what I experienced with this particular school. Other people?
Can you hear me? Is this thing working? No. Yeah. Is it working? I think we've got a very different dynamic here. Where I was previously, it was a 4-hour bus trip from the main center where we've got most of our business. And the teachers always used to complain and say that it's a whole day of programming that you are losing by sitting on the bus on the return journey, where it could be at a venue and the kids could, or the learners could be doing something more practical. That was a challenge for us. I've never really considered even using the bus as part of the trip, as such as Pete's talking about. And then I know now where we are significantly closer to the main center where I work now. And it makes a huge difference. The kids arrive fresh. It's an hour away at most. They are enthusiastic when they arrive. They're still lively. And it makes a massive difference on the actual cost of the excursion or the camp also, because the transport is so much further reduced.
Jacob, maybe you want to comment on this. The actual use of the bus time is something that I actually got into while working in WA, because you just seem to, from particularly the city of Perth, you seem to drive a lot of distance before you actually get to program venues. And so you have kids or students on buses for a long time. Yeah,
that's definitely true. For me personally, though, I work at a lot of the facilities where the kids come to us. But I have been on programs where, they're on buses for many, many, many hours. Like if we go down to the Stirling Ranges, for instance, it's up to 4 hours on a bus, just sitting there waiting, sleeping, playing on their phones, whatever they do.
I read some interesting articles that weren't talking directly about outdoor education, but they were talking about transportation to school and to school events and stuff like that. And it was kind of mentioning this idea of the longer the kids are on the bus, then kind of like Alan was saying, it like eats out of a lot of their time. And by the time they get there, they're much more tired and everything. So this article was talking about how kids who ride the bus for longer periods of time get less sleep and less exercise. So that kind of plays into that same idea. The longer they're on the bus, then the less time that they have at the activity that they're doing. On the contrary to that, there was another article that's talking about the benefits of going longer distances to more to better, it was talking about better schools and with better curricular and everything like that. So same with this is like, do you take them a short distance because it's quicker and easier, even though it's some place that maybe they could go on their own, or do you take them somewhere further away that takes longer to get there, but it's a lot better place or a more significant place or more interesting. And kind of going along with what Pete's talking about is, I'm going to play devil's advocate on the time use in the bus, is that one thing I would argue here is that, with a lot of kids, pretty much every part of their day is planned out. And especially on these programs, every part of their day is planned out of doing something. So then do we want to then impose even more on the kids by making them do stuff during the bus ride? Because then they don't get any like downtime or town, just to hang out with each other. Just a thought.
Sure, I might pick up from that line of thought. I think you raised some really interesting points about like the location of where you're going to and what those programming choices might mean. And I think it's like opens another really interesting box, which maybe isn't really for today's discussion, but I think is really worthwhile raising about like how you want to position the environment you're taking your students to, or like whoever is engaging in the outdoors. Because obviously you could talk about being somewhere that's maybe a bit closer, that might be more accessible post experience. But I think that might also be a really good way of kind of highlighting to people the importance of conservation of their like local areas. Because often when we do these longer drives, and you know, much like yourself, Pete, Dave, and everyone else in the room, I've been privy to really long drives to get to programs. You know, sometimes that I think can also kind of like bring our students so that they're very much, they don't realize that where we're going is anywhere near their own experience or where they live. And I think that can also, just in my opinion, and like I haven't really read any research that backs this up, but it'd be interesting to kind of do a bit more research on whether that actually means that when they go back to the classroom or back to like wherever they consider home, whether like some of the environmental kind of learnings and teachings that we're trying to impart to them are able to kind of move back into a space that is known to them. And I think that's something that, and obviously that comes to like a bigger debate about programming, but it's something that's really, I think also worthwhile when you think about transportation and how you set up what the transportation's about. And segueing back then, I guess, into my other thought around how you can use that time on a bus, I think it, yeah, maybe is a good question as to whether you do want to front load the experience or transportation with more information or less information, to try and get people either to think about where they're going or to give them the space to recognize there is time between where they're heading.
Yeah, very valid, Henry. Couple of points around that is, I think the advantage of going long distances, obviously within the unique environment we have here in Australia, you can actually change people's environmental circumstances. And I think there's quite a bit of value in that in programming. But I think that returning to what Cherie said, I think the bus trip is also a great time for students to get perhaps out of the headspace of their busy lives and into a sort of more calm headspace before the program actually starts. What do other people think? Busy lives and sort of more, what do other people think?
I think a lot of it depends on the age group and I think a lot of it and the bus itself. The age group and sorry, we've got a lag.
I think we've just got a repeat.
let me can you hear me now? Is that better? Oh, okay. So good. So I think that that it depends on the age group and it depends on the emotional environment of the bus. So if it's everyone's very excited and it's loud and it's noisy and you're going to get very. Let me try again. Is that better? Okay. So I think it depends on the age group and the emotional environment of the bus. That everyone's very loud and noisy, you're not going to get anything done. If people are calm and attentive, then you could get some stuff done on the trip.
Aaron, you brought up a point that it depends on the program outcomes. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Maybe Aaron walked away.
No, she said before that her mic's broken.
I think getting back to that point though is maybe a good thing to highlight. I'm not too sure whether all programs take into consideration the transportation as part of your program outcomes. So I know obviously, you know, like every program has a set of outcomes, but whether people are actively, and I'd be really interested to see whether like other people have had the experience of chatting about transportation when thinking about programming and programming outcomes. But my experience is that I think it's probably something that's left kind of as a separate thought process in terms of, okay, these are our program outcomes. This is how we're going to get that outcome. You know, say we want it, I don't know, in like Girraween National Park, for example, which is in Queensland, like, okay, well, I guess we have to bus our students there. Or, you know, like, oh, we want to do something that's related to the beach for like whatever programming reasons we've determined, well, you know, we might need to take like a ferry there or something. I feel, at least in my experience, that the transportation is something that simply flows as a result of, you know, like, I guess, where the programming is and then what do we need to do to get that programming. But I'd be really interested to see if anyone has an experience where like transportation has come into part of the programming plan at an earlier stage.
So I did a program early December in Sydney with a large organisation for a very large school, 14 groups, GPS school, so greater public school, so a private marketplace. And it was an urban adventure framework. So whilst we met the group at a certain location, and there was 3 hub start locations, and they did bushwalking and sea kayaking. The mode of transport to get around the inner city and the harbour area, which most people would be aware of, was via public transport. So it was, giving the students, paid go cards, so swipe on, swipe off, wearing masks. And because they were local, they were used to that, but it was still a year 8 program at the end of the year 8. So they're 13 going on 14. Very capable young men getting on and off public transport, but we had to deal with, interestingly, the complexity of COVID happening in and around Sydney, and a minor outbreak happening not long after that actual program, which was very fortunate for me because the program occurred and I was out of town before the outbreak. But the point I was making is the stress was more on me as the instructor, being from out of Sydney, about getting on and off boats and trains and buses, and then having limitations of only 25 people maximum on a bus, which would normally have 50. And I've got half my group on, and the bus driver says, stop, I can't take anyone else. And I say to him, well, either I bring the 14 people that you've already got on off, or you take us all. And he ended up taking us all. And it was a nice express bus to our destination. But it was a really interesting, it was a good usage of public transport system outside of all the COVID challenges we might have encountered, to actually have some young men use their own brains to work out how to get from A to B. They had a planning session beforehand, and they chose to get extra points for their urban adventure. It was all based around points and challenge, by not using a tablet during the program. So they had no phones, no smartphones, no technology. They had to just use their brains and the urban transport planning, and away they went. And whilst it wasn't transport to and from a venue, it was transport around the venue that wasn't human power, so it wasn't kayaking or walking. So it worked really well for the needs of that group, and for the actual program design. But Sydney, lent itself to that. Has anyone had other experiences like that?
I think Erin's put a really great one in the chat about how she uses transport as part of her programming goals. So I'll just speak on behalf of Erin because her mic is muted. Erin just mentions that if you are going to use the time during transportation, she just says, you need to question whether it fits in your program goals. So for her year 12 class, which is their second final expedition, Erin was driving the bus, but the students were directing her and telling her when to stop for fuel, and they were also managing themselves in the group and stops and so forth. So I think that's probably a really good progression in terms of how sequentially you might be able to change who is managing the transport experience. And probably a really good example of where transport is thought about as part of the programming goals and outcomes. Thank you, Erin. And I think about public transport is a really way to kind of speak to limitations and implications of transport, and what different transport options have as kind of their positives and negatives. So did anyone want to speak maybe to what you see as current limitations with transport at the moment?
I'll just put out something there quickly. When I was looking up stuff for this session, I found that right now the COVID safety guidelines for public transport say that you, in New South Wales anyway, say you can only have 50% capacity. Whereas if you're on a private charter, they can actually, there's no limits to how many people they have and where you sit or anything like that. So I found that really interesting, the difference between public transport and then doing a private coach. So has anybody had any issues with private coaches or with programs yet?
Yeah, I can make a few comments around that from my experience at the University of the Sunshine Coast. So last year, prior to the pandemic, we would just transport students on 24, 25-seater, 30-seater buses to venues. And the university then said, well, it's very hard for people to physically distance while on buses, so we're not actually going to transport students on buses anymore. What we're going to do is actually get, and bearing in mind that these are adult learners, so we're going to get students to self-drive to venues, and the staff will meet the students at the venues, and then we'll run the program from there. And from a programming point of view, I would say that the quality of the programming has actually increased because the students, when they arrive at the venue, that there's no doubt about when the program starts. It sort of starts when they get to the venue, and there's a whole lot of things that don't come into play. And I don't want to get into detail of what happens on university programs, but the program ends when everyone has done the cleanup at the venue, and then everyone gets in their private cars and leaves. So everyone's involved in the program from start to finish. And from a staff member's point of view, I found it a much easier model to work with students than potentially having, 25 students on a bus for a couple of hours and then having to get them off the bus and then orientate them to the program. So that's one experience. The other thing I'd sort of like to bring up is, anyone had any experiences, and I know USC is doing a little bit of this this year and has done a bit last year, where people start programs at the actual place that they're doing their learning, whether that be a school or university, and they actually leave from the gate and they go on a local program using whatever means they do to do that program, and then they return to that setting which they're actually studying in. Has anyone had any other experiences with that type of thing? Because I think that's a very interesting type of programming, and it keeps it very local, and it takes transport really out of the program altogether. And as I said earlier before the session started, I've just read Tim Flannery's new book on the climate crisis. And I tell you what, we need to stop driving to programs in fossil fuel driven vehicles.
Well, one of the things that we're looking at, we're finding we have a lot of schools that fund, the amount of money they spend becomes quite critical, as to whether they can run a program. And we're starting to look at, can we, for instance, at Wangaratta, rather than them driving to Mount Buffalo or Beechworth to go abseiling, can we find something in Wangaratta that we can do there where they can either ride their push bikes or walk, or perhaps even use public transport, as you're saying. So that takes the whole bus equivalent out, which might mean a program can actually go ahead and the students or the school can afford it.
David, what would you estimate the percentage of program costs are in terms of transport to and from venues for like an average client for you? Because I know that's normally factored separately from the outdoor centre or the provider's cost, because transport to and from venue is usually handed to the school client.
Probably somewhere between 15 and 25%, depending on how far they're travelling. If they're going from, say, Melbourne to Mount Buffalo, both return travel, I would suggest that the transport is quite a large percentage of their if that's rented transport. Some schools, of course, get over it by having their own bus, but I reckon it's an interesting question, actually. It'd be worth actually having a look to see what is that percentage, and if we change that, does that mean we're going to have better programs or more programs or the like?
I could, I guess, speak to that. I had 2 years as director at Fraser Coast Anglican College, and unfortunately, there was only one bus company that serviced the Hervey Bay area. So most of the programming being at least an hour, if not further, in transport costs, there was not much negotiation between myself and anybody in terms of transport costs. The cheapest programming I ran was actually on Fraser, because I utilized parents' four-wheel drives en masse to take my entire Year 6 cohort, which was about 50 students, to Fraser. The parents got onto the island with their vehicles and they loved that, and they were out with their students. So it was a very different way to manage the program, because I had to actually do some driver training and some vehicle checks on parents' vehicles prior to the program to make sure I was ticking the risk management responsibilities I held at that point.
I really like that concept, Dave. How did it work for the students and parents involved?
Yeah, it was. There was two variations over 2 years. Just very quickly, the first year we went with what had been traditionally done, and we'd had a large number of hired four-wheel drives from a local hire company that specialised on servicing Fraser. And Fraser Island being a sand island, you've got to be a decent four-wheel drive. And then we split the group with a hired large beach vehicle that is all, it gets used by the tourist groups on Fraser Island. And then the second year, the policy had changed on the island. So the venue managers, the parks, had basically changed it and said that there was no more sideways facing seats. Your vehicle needed to have certain safety requirements, and it became excessively costly to the program, and would have meant the program would have shut down for that year level. To actually have gone with hiring all their vehicles, so we put the call out to the parents in the cohort, and father son driving, or mum and son driving, and 3 other students, and usually 2 adults in the vehicle, so there wasn't one adult by themselves. And it became quite a different program design, because I had not just 50 odd year 6 students and some teachers, but I had a large number of parents along as well, driving vehicles and being in support. So it became more of a family oriented sort of feel to the program, and definitely changed it, but meant that we could still run the program quite well. And I think to a certain extent, they're still doing it the same way. But that was driven by environmental considerations and safety, because of rollover of vehicles that were hired and the cost factor involved. We couldn't afford it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Pete, you raise a great comment in the chat.
Yeah, I just think, if we're trying to offer outdoor programming to people, the cost of transportation and perhaps the sustainability of transportation seems to be a bit of a barrier to getting people involved. If I can take a group of people and walk out of the place that out of the school gate or out of the university campus or whatever I'm working on, and do a program, then it's a big argument for local programming, I think, because you take that, that as David well pointed out, the 15 to 25% cost of programming goes out of the program costs altogether. So I see it as programming is more affordable to more people. What do other people think?
I think that's a really good point, Pete. And I think that comes to accessibility as well, because if you are in the middle of Sydney, then you're not going to get the same experience necessarily leaving out of your school as you would if you were in Wagga. Plus, you got to think about the idea that some people, I guess that you wouldn't have the same access to the materials, because a lot of, when I think about centers, and I think Jacob said he worked at a center, so maybe he could speak on this a little bit, but when you work at centers, all of that is purpose built to enhance the experience, I think, and what's there and everything. So I think that can add to the benefits of having those types of things. Whereas the other way, basically all the stuff would have to be, you'd have to find this provider willing to take all of those things to that location. And then once again, you're still getting some travel costs and stuff, because you'd have to transport all that material. And sometimes that might not, say if you wanted to go climbing, might not necessarily have climbing anywhere near the school, whereas you would have climbing at this area.
We were
Would love to-
operating a, sorry,
You go, David.
we were operating a program down in Point Cook in Melbourne in the western suburbs for Caramballoch College, which a number of years ago started up as a new pair of schools. It's not a very rich area. And we ran all of their programs, but half of the programs we did, the principal wanted them done in the local area. So we would use the local beach, we'd use the local river, work programs around. And a lot of that was to try and get the kids, and in some cases the parents, to be aware that even though they were in an urban area, there's those little places that you can find that you can go for a walk, you can ride your bike, you can paddle a kayak, that you don't have to travel a long way, so that you could get a bit of local work-life balance. So that was not only an economic thing. It was about educating people about what was in their own area. And then in the older, by the time they got to say year 9, 10, and 11, we took them away somewhere so that they could experience different types of environments in the state. From the dry environments to the alpine and the like. But I thought with the utilising the local area just so that people were aware of what was there, because we don't know what's in our own area. We always tend to go somewhere else. Yeah.
I really like that comment, David. And I think just going off what Sheree was saying as well, I think the aim of outdoor education, not necessarily to teach people like, how to climb or how to abseil or like how to hike. I think we use those things as a medium to teach like greater life skills and like learning about resilience and leadership and teamwork and those types of things that, we talk about as the reason why we do programming or why we make specific programming choices. And I think, there's a lot to be argued about the fact that, just because you might not have a high ropes course or a cliff you can rock climb on or abseil down, doesn't necessarily mean that we still can't facilitate the same learning outcomes in a really positive way. And I think, David, your point about getting people aware of what's in their backyard is like pretty amazing. Whilst, you can do that and still gain the same outcomes that you're trying to achieve. I think it's amazing that we can do that maybe with a lot less travel costs. And that's where, you might start thinking about what are the actual programming decisions you make, whether it be, not using like activities that require a lot of gear to be moved or that type of thing. I think that's where you can start making some really interesting choices around how you program.
And look, it might depend on whether you're in a country town, a regional area, which city, but like around Sydney, for instance, there's an awful lot of water. You don't have to travel far to, amazing paddling. And you've got a surprising number of cliffs in the urban area. Quite often you could catch a train or a bus somewhere and there's some cliff on the edge of a park. In Melbourne, you've got waterways, but you've got a lot of creeks with green zones and walking trails and stuff. The Merry Creek and that, where you can hop on it and you don't even notice that the city's all around you. You might have to travel a little bit further to a cliff, but they're there. Like the Yangs is on the edge of the city. You can get most of the way there on in public transport.
I'm going to flop to the other side and say that I completely agree with what David's saying. And that, like, when you think about the importance of teaching people about the local area and about accessing those local areas, that those kids probably have a greater connection to those areas, and it kind of strengthens that bond. And so they probably care more about it than, if you go somewhere far away, it kind of distances them physically and maybe mentally from what they've learned on that experience. Whereas if you do it in a place where they can go whenever they want, then it kind of forms a stronger connection and a stronger mental connection in their mind of those experiences, and then how it can relate to them where they are.
We've got found a different dynamic here also, in that some groups actually want to travel. Because, well, I'll give you an example. Our closest town is 12 kilometers away, and we get almost no business from the schools there. because they say it's just around the corner. They want to go somewhere further. So most of our business comes from 40 to 50 kilometers away, sometimes further. And the people that are right near us prefer to carry on, drive an hour or 2 hours away to somewhere else, simply because it gives that mindset or that space that we are actually disassociating from where we are and moving into a new environment.
Do you think that's, Alan, part of the idea of adventure being someplace that's not a local location, or just a change in location to allow the pedagogy to be, and we can move on to the discussing the value of international expeditions and sustainability there. But what would you think that's what's the driving force behind clients' expectations around that?
I think it's familiarity with the area. So they want to give them a new experience more than anything else. So by being just around the corner, well, we know what this mountain looks like, we know what the area is, and so on. And they actually want them to be further out of their comfort zone, would be a better way to put it, than just saying, well, because it's so close, mom could come and pick me up, or dad could come and rescue me, or so on. Whereas when it's a further distance, you're actually there, and homesickness is not a option to just say mom and dad can come and fetch me. So I think that's one of the big factors. And then also what sites offer. So like all of us, different places offer different things.
Well, can I open the elephant in the room, because it has become quite trendy, at least in Australia, with a certain group of particular people who provide outdoor education programs to travel overseas, although it's not going on as much in the current environment, to do programming on an international level. What are people's thoughts about this as a type of programming and the sustainability of this particular thing? But I will bring you all back to the point that Aaron made at the start of early in the session, which is that I think it really depends on your programming goals, or what your purpose is in your programs.
Pete, Aaron also raises another great point that I was also thinking about in terms of, I guess, international outdoor ed experiences, or international travel is always going to be inherently discriminatory to those who can't afford to pay for it. So it does, by its very nature, cut out a large segment of the people we're trying to target. And I think it's, that makes it difficult, because obviously you limit the value you can give when you limit the amount of people that can access a program. So I think that's a really valid point. I would probably say I agree with you that it is very program dependent. Like, what your outcome is really depends on how you're going to achieve it. Are there ways that we can do a similar thing to going overseas in Australia? Most probably. But, I think there seems to be an allure of going overseas. It's that idea of maybe like a bohemian idea of having to be international to kind of know yourself, or to properly engage with the rest of the world. So I think it's an interesting thing that maybe has developed as a result of the international becoming very globalized. So, we're more interconnected than ever before. And as a result of that, I think programming, following on from that, has also become more globalized, because that's the way we see we can better engage our students with a world that will continue to stay globalized into the future, I think.
I can jump in again and offer an opinion. I went and did a study tour with my university and a student group that was all future outdoor education teachers in 2018 to Singapore. So very much a first world country, but looking at their outdoor ed programs, both within a private school market that's very affluent and the state government there in Singapore, which is extremely extensively supportive of outdoor education. They don't see much, at least within the context of the private school environment, as going to places like Malaysia, which is half a K away, but going to places further afield as India as not part of what they would normally consider an outdoor ed program. And in a lot of cases, in an affluent environment, that was where they were taking their older senior school students, whether it was self-directed touring, but there'd always be a community-based focus, whether it was building a school or doing some sort of exchange of cultures. And they saw that as very valuable within those schools. Within the Singapore state school system, just very quickly, very much more center-based, what we'd expect, what we experience here in Australia, as far as large numbers, but absolutely fantastic quality facilitation, teachers being employed and queuing up to actually be part of that experience. So for me as a participant in an outdoor experiential education international trip, I learned a lot from that by seeing a different perspective in outdoor education in a foreign country that's not too dissimilar to me, but definitely had some changes. So there's definitely swings and roundabouts. I've never done the world trips or expeditions that are run by multiple companies in this country, but if anyone's got an opinion on that, it'd be interesting to hear too.
As a international and somebody who likes to travel, it is kind of one of those, fights as an outdoor person who is conscious of the environment, but also somebody who really enjoys traveling and going overseas and seeing new things. I think I've personally got a lot of value out of going to different countries, and it's definitely changed my world perspective. Coming from a very conservative Christian family, growing up in a very Bible Belt environment, I think one of the best things I did was travel and see other places, because it helped me better understand the world around me. And kind of when you talk about that cultural exchange and what you can learn from other countries, that's why there's big summits and, for all these big national things, and there's national summits for outdoors and just what the YMCA and just so much, because they see the value in transferring knowledge across different countries. And I think the same is very valuable for outdoor ed and students, acknowledging, of course, the limitation that comes with the cost of it is very difficult as well. But it also, I think it depends on at what age you're talking about. Like if you're talking about high schoolers, most of those who can afford to go on these trips their parents can afford also to take them on these trips personally. Whereas maybe at a university level, it's a bit different, the cultural exchange at that level, and going overseas to see different things or do different activities, I think can be very valuable, mostly because you probably have to earn that money yourself, or at least that was my experience.
I'm just going to quickly jump in and perhaps open a bit of a can of worms on the elephant in the room. I think this is all great, but I think that we spend quite a bit of time in educating in the outdoors, talking about the natural environment and perhaps the protection of the natural environment in which we work in. And I just wanted to ask people, how do they think that driving or flying or doing a combination of all these activities fits into our sustainable relationship with the natural environment, with the current climate crisis that we're actually dealing with in our world?
So, Pete, to rephrase that question, maybe, can we operate without transport as centers? Or are we in the catch-22 where we actually need the transport to get people to the places where we want to do the programs with them? Because the alternative is we need to do on-site at schools. So how do we find the balance?
Alan, in my comments, I was in no way saying it's not a complex question And I don't think there's an easy answer to it. But I think that as people who are perhaps advocates for the natural environment and the protection of the natural environment, I think it's a conversation that I at least have regularly with my students. And but I think in our practice is that conversation reflected as well as we can have it.
I think that
so
go on, Alan.
Go ahead. Okay, so a way that I might look at it is, not that I've considered it at the moment, but would be to say, how can I offset my carbon usage by something that I change at the venue or on the program, so that we have, at the end of the day, we have a neutral or beneficial balance.
I think if we think about what you said, we were talking about earlier about the cost of transportation of a bus or something like that. So on the other hand, you either have a bus of students or you have every student drive individually versus the bus. Then it kind of goes into, oh, actually the bus is probably better for the environment versus everybody driving individually.
Or even more efficient would be, can you take a train? Because a train has far less environmental impact than a bus or a vehicle.
Maybe it's a combination as well. Like often, you know, your centre-based programs or hard tops aren't somewhere where you can get public transport directly to, but surely if we're using a train for 90% or 80% of the journey, you know, that's so much better for the environment. And then maybe swapping to the bus for the last 20 minutes of the transportation, maybe that's the thing that we need to start looking at as programming, not removing transportation, but actually looking at how we might be able to swap between to get, you know, to the lowest carbon emissions for each section of the journey.
And I think if you're running an expedition programming to a greater or less extent, you try and make the programming end to end from your public transport or coaches human powered. So again, you draw in the conclusions and intentional programming design of don't have an internal bus shuttle within your program unless it's absolutely necessary. Have them walk, paddle, ride a bike, something that will actually support the program outcomes, but will actually, and I know Pete's done that within programming that he's designed in the past. It's very challenging to do that, and sometimes you have to compromise and really change what the actual outcomes of last year's program looks like significantly, but it usually works really well, I find.
Can I just add to your comments, David, which I think are very valid, that if we are busing students in mid-program, it actually changes their experience on that program. They move, and I've seen it happen. They move out of the program headspace, they get onto a bus, they ask the driver, hey, can we have the radio on? Can we do this? Even if it's a short bus trip. And their total headspace around the program changes. And then they get off the bus and you spend, depending on the students, a lot of time reintegrating them into that program and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, completely agree, Pete. It's very challenging when you have those midsection bus, and lots of cases they're not necessary. It's just because programmers or program managers haven't conceived an alternative or have been able to be innovative or creative in their access between a point A and point B. And sometimes it's also driven by logistics as well. Yeah, they've run out of canoes.
Dependent on program logistics and venue and a whole range of different issues. But
land access, yeah.
Ideally, I think if you could find a center that's about 20 to 40 Ks away from where your school is, then you could bike from your school to the center, and then you just transport all of their gear there, which would cut down on the vehicles used, and then everybody be biking, and that's one of the best forms of transportation. And same on the way back. Like they might have to stay overnight. I'm not sure exactly how many Ks kids can do on biking, but I figure they can do it. They could probably do at least 20 Ks a day.
I don't think I could anymore.
But again, Cherie, I think that's a great idea, but I think it's very limited to the location of the school, and you know, like there are schools in, like, and I'll use Sydney as an example because I know it pretty well. There's schools in inner city Sydney. You could bike for 40 Ks and you'd still be in the city. So, like, yes, it's a good idea, but I think that I think it's sort of something that it's dependent on the location of the school and where you're actually trying to get to. But like, I think we need to think innovatively about transport as we move further into this time, rather than doing the same thing that we've been doing for a long time.
If they're in the city, they can take the trains out to a further location where they can pick up the bikes to take out to the center. Problem solved.
Excellent work.
That's the answer. We all need to take trains to the venue. Yes. As I said at the start, I think it's a very complex question, but I think it's one that as we move further into this century, that we all, as lovers of nature and providers of amazing nature-based outdoor education experiences, we need to really address within the context of our programming, or that's what I believe anyway.
Mm.
I think we're going to have a problem going forward here. I don't know what tourism situation is like in Australia at the moment, but with us going in and out of lockdowns and having zero international tourism for the last 10 months, a lot of our bus companies are now closing down. They're just simply no business. So the same people who transported our learners from schools also transported international tourists. So we're going to have a challenging dynamic of how to get learners to camps in cost-effective and environmentally friendly ways in the near future when we're allowed to do work again.
Yeah, I think that poses some real questions, Alan. I'm not too sure of the answer there. I think we've been relatively lucky in Australia, at least in Queensland. I haven't really heard of any bus companies that have been struggling too much. But obviously, like Queensland also has been relatively lucky with staying out of lockdown. And I think that's probably something that there'll be a whole lot of unintended consequences of COVID, not just with like transport, but everything around outdoor ed, you know, like shops that close down that supply gear. You know, there might be a number of suppliers that are in the same way that they just feel a pinch. I think the one thing that we've got up our sleeves is that as a result of the lockdown and just generally people not being able to travel, like outdoor stores themselves have been doing really well. And so I know like most of them are in a better position than they were 12 months ago because like everyone who's sitting at home is suddenly buying outdoors gear so that they can, you know, finally discover their backyard. So I think at least there is some positives for the industry and the fact that, you know, our mainstays in terms of gear stores and things like that should be fine. But I'd be really interested to hear whether anyone else has had similar experiences as parts of the supply chain kind of going down as a result of COVID.
Yeah, well, we've got lots of centres that are now closing down and just simply cannot continue. There's been almost 10 months of no income or very, very little income. And we had good bookings again for February, from early January until the end of February with schools. And then our government decided that, well, that everything is shut down again, high level because of a second peak. And we've lost all business. So, and there's lots of us, this is the we're now in critical survival mode. But one of the negative things apart from that is there's a number of centers that are now saying, are there businesses that are, or venues, how can I say, the larger organizations that have been able to sustain themselves, and will they be able to buy out the smaller centers? And unfortunately, what happens is then you're pushing out you're changing the whole dynamic of the industry to the big corporates are the ones that are going to control everything, and the small people on the side who had the dynamic and the ability to be able to change and to be relevant are the ones that are going to be are going to lose their market share.
I do know that here in Australia, I know there have been a few centers that have closed down, or at least I know of one in New South Wales that's closed because of lack of business.
I was about to say, this is probably a bit of a different one for you. I do some volunteering at the Perth Observatory. So it's still outdoors, you get to see space. But as a result of that, instead of having the regular tours, they obviously had to shut down for a little while, which they lost a fair bit of money for. Then when they put the tours back on, they put it in reduced numbers. And now they've basically booked out until the middle of this year. And so they just can't fill the capacity, basically. Sorry, the other way around. They've got too much capacity.
I'll just point everybody, Sri might want to talk about it more, a link to transportgeography.org. It's an article about transport systems. There's a link that Sri found when we were doing a little bit of research during the lead up to today's discussion. So some interesting stuff there. Do you want to read, do you want to talk about that, Sri? As we're wrapping up, close to being finished here.
Yeah, it's just a general article talking about transportation and how it affects the environment. It's got really good information about the impacts and kind of looks at it in a broader sense of how it affects everything. And so there's some really great graphs in there too. So if you're a visual person, there are some good graphs for you to look at. It's just a really interesting look at how basic kind of what Pete was saying about the book that he's reading, and just thinking about how we're impacting the environment, and maybe then being conscious of those so that we can then make changes that that kind of work for both being able to do the activities and helping the environment. I think we're getting towards the end of this session. Does anybody else have anything that they want to add, or that they've been dying to say this whole time and just haven't had the chance? Okay, well, I hope you guys don't mind. I'm going to step in here and give our quote of the week. And I really hope Erin doesn't mind me using her quote from earlier, and I've just tweaked it just a little bit. But I thought it was really good. And I've just added one word. Outdoor activities are the vehicle to the lifelong lessons to be learned. And that was Erin Campbell, who's in our session now. So I just thought it was a really good wordplay. So I thought I'd add that as our quote of the week.
And a lovely quote it is to end. Thank you all for participating in the first of the OutHouses for 2021. We convene again on the third Monday of this month, and first and third Monday of every month. You can also check us out on the World Wide Web at insidetheouthouse.org, and invite your friends. Tell us what's going on. We'd love to have your opinion on things. Thanks very much for coming back or attending again, or if you're a first timer, have a great day. Thanks.